They say that in a quiet coastal village where fishermen haul in their catch before dawn, a blind herbalist lived at the edge of the sand dunes. Every morning, she walked the shoreline with a weathered basket in her arms and her fingertips brushing over shells and driftwood, guided by the soft crash of the waves. The villagers called her old-fashioned, even superstitious, a relic from a forgotten time. They whispered that no modern medicine could predict her strange poultices or the pungent scents of her boiling herbs. But as the sun rose and the mist lifted, she collected the small white blooms of seaside daisies, the salty roots of beach grasses, and the twisted bark of an ancient banyan tree. To her, these plants were more than just weeds. They were life. Despite her reputation for healing, most of the villagers laughed at her. Officials in crisp uniforms strutted past her humble hut, their shiny shoes kicking up dust, and made jokes about her blindness. "She can't even see her own hands," they said, pointing and chuckling. "How could she ever save anyone's life, let alone cure a fever?" But there were a few who listened when she spoke in soft, measured tones about the power of nature. Those who had fallen ill when the clinic was closed at night, or whose children had fevers that modern doctors could not break, would sometimes bring her simple offerings, fresh-caught fish or a basket of warm bread from the baker down the road. In return, she would teach them to brew the teas that eased pain, reduce swelling, and soothe restless minds. To them, she was a quiet guardian, a healer who walked with unseen wisdom. Miles away in the capital city, things were very different. The president lay in a sterile hospital room under bright lights that held no comfort, surrounded by machines that beeped like restless ghosts. His body was racked with fever, sweat glistening on his brow as his breath came in shallow gasps. The best doctors in the country, armed with the most advanced medicine money could buy, had tried every injection, every infusion, every risky procedure. Yet no matter what they did, the president did not improve. His condition seemed to be slipping away like sand through their fingers, and panic seeped into the corridors of power. In a private chamber down the hall, his chief aide, a middle-aged man with deep lines etched onto his face, stared at a folder of grim medical reports. He had spent years serving this president, managing crises, smoothing over scandals, and ensuring that the leader's image remained unblemished. But now, as he watched the president's life hang in the balance, he felt a helplessness he had never known. The aides outside whispered that the world was watching, that any sign of weakness could spark political chaos. And so, in desperation, he scoured every scrap of information he could find. That was when he noticed an old brochure tucked behind a stack of official papers, an invitation to a village festival where the herbalist was said to demonstrate her remedies. The brochure was faded, corners frayed, but the picture of the blind woman smiling at a small crowd captured his attention. Why would the president's team keep such a thing, if not for a forgotten hope? Back in the village, the herbalist felt the change in the wind before the first motorcade arrived. Even though her eyes could not see, she sensed a disturbance in the air. The usual calls of seabirds and the distant laughter of children were replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sound was the low rumble of engines drawing closer. She set aside her basket of herbs and walked to the edge of her porch, leaning on her cane as she felt the vibrations of the vehicles passing over the sandy road. A parade of black SUVs spilled onto the village square and stopped abruptly. Men in dark suits stepped out, their faces grim. They arranged themselves like sentinels around a tall woman holding a clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line. This was the president's chief aide, searching for her. A hush fell over the gathering villagers who peered from behind flickering lanterns and shuttered windows. Many recognized him from news photographs, his face captioned as the right hand of the most powerful man in the land. Now he was calling out the herbalist's name, his voice echoing beneath the coconut palms. "Madam, we need your help," he called. Even the waves seemed to pause as the villagers exchanged nervous glances. No one dared answer. They had mocked her for years, calling her remedies nothing but folk tales. Yet now they watched in silence as this powerful stranger sought her out. Inside her hut, the herbalist listened. She paused, listening to the uneven thump of her heart as if it were a drum announcing a battle. She knew, without seeing, what this meant. A life was at stake. Her life's work had led her to this moment, though she never thought it would matter to the highest offices of the land. She straightened her shoulders, reached for her old leather pouch, and nodded to herself. Then she walked toward the door, steering by the smell of fresh earth and the faint whir of excitement in the air. As she crossed the threshold, the crowd parted, curiosity and fear warring in their eyes. The chief aide offered a bow, but she simply nodded in return. She did not speak until they had driven back to the capital, and she stood, still barefoot, in the cold tiled hallway of the Grand Hospital. Nurses gasped when they saw the simple clay pot she carried, filled with water that bubbled to a faint steam. She asked for fresh leaves of a plant they had never heard of, mangrove blossoms that grew by the tidal pools, and roots from a highland herb no longer in most apothecaries. Confusion turned to skepticism as the doctors challenged her, saying they had never seen such ingredients in their journals. But the president's fever roared higher, reaching into a realm the machines could no longer measure. Something guided them to heed her words. That night, lightning split the sky into jagged lines of white, and rain pounded the hospital roofs as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the man inside. In a small storeroom, lit by a single lamp, the herbalist worked by feel. Her fingers brushed over each dried leaf, each hidden spice, mixing them with careful precision. There was a kind of magic in the air, but it was not the magic of superstition. It was the culmination of decades spent listening to stories of how plants healed and hurt, how each root had history, how each bloom held secrets passed down through whispered lullabies. As she ground the herbs with her mortar and pestle, she murmured a soft prayer for strength and clarity. The room smelled of earth and rain, and the hum of machines seemed distant, as though the world itself had narrowed to this moment. Meanwhile, in the president's room, family members gathered around his bed, unwilling to believe the stories that something as simple as a herbal remedy could turn the tide. They clutched photographs and cards sent by world leaders, hoping the collective goodwill would manifest as a miracle. They had watched his condition descend like a dark storm, curtains drawn over his once vibrant spirit. The aides had assembled, in a tense circle outside, speaking in hushed tones about contingency plans, sorting out who would take charge if the worst came to pass. Their faces were pale under flickering fluorescent lights as the rain drummed on the windows. When the herbalist finally appeared at dawn, sunbeams slanting through the rain-smeared glass, she held a small clay cup filled with warm amber liquid. Her blind eyes seemed to glow with purpose. The doctors, accustomed to sterile vials and bright syringes, gaped at the humble offering. But the chief aide, whose world had narrowed to hope and desperation, lifted the cup to the president's lips. The room held its breath as the leader took a sip. Silence stretched for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, then two, then three. Outside, the rain slackened and a hush fell over the waiting nurses and aides. It was as if time itself paused, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the president's hand twitched, his pulse steadied, and a color flushed back to his cheeks. The machines that had wailed in alarm now ticked in cautious rhythm. Nurses rushed to check his vitals, and the doctors exchanged astonished glances. Could this simple remedy, made of plants gathered under moonlight on a sandy beach, truly hold the power to heal a man whose life hung by a thread? Whispers broke the silence. How did she know? Where did she learn this? Can this be real? The words tumbled into the air like shards of wonder and disbelief, but as the president's eyes fluttered open, the room brimmed with tension. No one knew what would happen next. Would he thank the herbalist? Would the officials, who once mocked her, return to her doorstep with apologies? Would the secret of her remedy spread beyond the village and change the way the nation saw its own traditions? Or would powerful forces in the capital try to suppress the truth and claim credit for saving their leader? In that suspended moment, everything felt uncertain, as if the world itself held its breath. And so, as the early morning light caught the rising steam from the president's bed, the promise of something extraordinary hovered in the air. A blind woman armed with nothing but herbs and unshakable belief had shaken the foundations of power. The question now was, would the remedy she prepared be enough to save him completely, or was this just the beginning of a journey that would challenge the hearts and minds of an entire nation? The tension in the room was thick, like the humid air before a storm, and no one could predict what the next hours would bring. What would the next moment reveal? Only time would tell. The young reporter from the Capitol leaned against the rough wooden railing of the porch, her notepad trembling in one hand, while her other hand cradled a worn recorder. She had arrived the moment the chief aide's convoy left the village, desperate to capture the story of the blind herbalist and her miracle remedy. Everywhere she looked, villagers whispered among themselves, some with pride, others with guilt that maybe they had been too quick to mock her. As dusk settled over the tangled palms, the reporter remembered the old woman's gentle voice explaining how each plant held a memory of the land, how every herb was a lesson in patience and respect. Now, that lesson had been thrust onto a national stage, and she knew the story could change lives far beyond these sand-swept roads. Back in the Capitol, the president's daughter paced the hospital corridor, her shoes clicking on the linoleum floor like a distorted metronome. She had always been close to her father. She remembered him reading children's books to her at bedtime, his deep voice turning simple tales into grand adventures. But now, as she watched the monitors tracking his heart rate and temperature, she felt helpless in a way she had never known. Doctors scurried past, exchanging worried glances with stern professional faces. Even the senior physician, a man with silver hair and a cold, calculating stare, could not hide the tension in his shoulders. The president's daughter had begged him to allow the herbalist to stay, arguing that if traditional treatments had failed, it was worth trying something new. The doctor had simply nodded, too focused on test results to offer sympathy. As night deepened, a low hum of activity filled the hospital. Nurses hovered outside the president's door, whispering prayers behind gloved hands. The herbalist sat on a wooden stool in a small anteroom, her fingers tracing the edges of a tattered cloak she had brought for warmth. The room smelled faintly of dried ginger and eucalyptus, her own personal sanctuary against the stark white walls and harsh, fluorescent lights. She could not see the anxious faces around her, but she felt their energy, the rapid pulse of hope and fear vibrating like thunder in the concrete. She thought of her childhood, when she first discovered the healing power of plants. She was 6 years old then, walking beside her grandmother through tangled paths, learning to crush leaves in a mortar and pestle, while her grandmother sang ancient lullabies. Those were better days before blindness settled over her like a shroud, and the villagers began to whisper that her gift was nothing but superstition. Meanwhile, the village felt emptier than usual. Without her presence, conversations about daily routines and fishing schedules had given way to hushed debates. Would the president truly recover? Would they see her as a hero? Or would the Capitol's elite twist her story into something unrecognizable? A young fisherman named Ahmed sighed as he pushed his palm along the cool wood of his fishing boat. He and his sister had been among the few who believed in the herbalist from the start. When his sister fell ill last year and the closest clinic refused to admit her at night, the blind woman had sent him home with a steaming tea that brought his sister back to life. Ahmed stared out at the silvery waves, wondering if the same remedy could save the man who held the fate of the nation in his hands. He felt pride, but also an ache of guilt. He had once joined the chorus of ridicule when officials sneered at her remedies. Now he carried memories of her kindness, wondering how easily people turned from respect to mockery. In the high towers of government, rumors buzzed like angry hornets. Some ministers whispered that the president's recovery was proof that Western medicine had failed, that it was time to invest in traditional remedies and rural health. Others feared that this blind herbalist would become a symbol of power they could not control. The finance minister, his dark suit crisp and his tie knotted tight, paced his private office. He worried about the implications, millions of dollars, already spent on imported drugs and expensive equipment, now overshadowed by a simple clay cup filled with herbal brew. If the president credited the herbalist publicly, it would upend medical industries and shift political loyalties. He clenched his jaw, drafting memos to urge caution, insisting that any public statement be carefully managed, that the herbalist's role be downplayed, perhaps presented as a cultural nod rather than a genuine cure. Back in the hospital room, The president opened his eyes and saw a blur of faces hovering above him. His daughter's tear-streaked eyes, the concerned brow of his chief aide, the gentle worry of the senior physician. His hand drifted toward the clay cup resting on a small table beside his bed, still warm with the herbal tea. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. His daughter gently lifted the cup to his lips again, and he sipped, tasting a blend of earth and sweetness, a flavor so different from the sterile syrups he had been given before. As he swallowed, he felt something shift inside, like heavy curtains pulling back to let the light in. The fever that had racked his body loosened its grip, and for the first time in days, his breath came easier. Doctors quickly gathered around, astonishment mingling with scientific curiosity. The physician, who had spent a lifetime trusting only in lab results, now stood uncertain. "What exactly did she give him?" he whispered, his voice hushed. Nurses exchanged notes on strange leaf names: mangrove blossom, coastal mint, moonlit vine, terms they had never seen in their medical textbooks. Even the small details seemed symbolic. The remedy was brewed at dawn when the world was neither night nor day, capturing a fleeting moment of balance between darkness and light. But not everyone embraced this balance. In a marble-cold conference room, the finance minister and several cabinet members met behind closed doors. Security cameras captured their serious faces as the minister spoke of political risk. "We cannot let this narrative spiral out of control," he warned. "We must frame the herbalist's role as supplementary, an act of goodwill, not a medical breakthrough. If we embrace it fully, we reward superstition over science. That sets a dangerous precedent." The room fell silent. A minister of education cleared his throat. "But what if this is exactly what our country needs? A reconnection to our roots, a healing of divisions between rural and urban communities?" he asked. The finance minister shook his head. "We can honor tradition, yes, but not at the expense of rational policy. We need a statement, carefully worded, that praises her compassion without suggesting her remedy is superior to modern medicine." While politics played out in high offices, the herbalist sat alone in the anteroom, unaware of the debates that could change her life forever. She hummed a lullaby her grandmother once sang, her fingers tracing the edges of her pouch. She felt a gentle pressure at the door and looked up instinctively, even though she could not see. A nurse stepped in quietly, offering a bowl of warm porridge. "You should eat," the nurse said softly. "You haven't had a proper meal since you arrived." The herbalist nodded gratefully. In that moment, the walls between them melted. Both understood the quiet compassion that connected them, bridging gaps of age and culture. As the herbalist ate, she thought of her grandmother, of the stories passed down through generations, stories of healers who risked everything to save others, stories of faith that thrived in the simplest acts. Outside the hospital, news spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with headlines: "Blind herbalist's miracle cure," "President's life saved by folk remedy." Debate threads exploded with opinions, some praising her as a folk hero, others denouncing her as a charlatan. A popular blogger traveled from the capital to the village seeking an interview. He arrived at dusk when lantern light flickered on the dusty paths, and found the herbalist surrounded by villagers who finally looked at her with awe instead of scorn. She greeted him with the same gentle smile she offered every visitor. When he asked how she felt about saving the president, she sighed, her blind eyes cast down for a moment. "I am just a messenger," she said in a quiet voice, "bringing what the land has given me. I did not save him alone." Her words echoed in the blogger's mind as he recorded every syllable. In the hospital's main ward, the president slowly regained strength each hour. His daughter sat by his side, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. She recalled the nights when he told her that power was not measured by wealth or weapons, but by compassion and empathy. She trusted that her father would remember those lessons and that he would credit the herbalist openly, regardless of the political consequences. But a part of her also feared the backlash, imagining powerful senators dismissing her father's recovery as a publicity stunt. She swallowed hard. feeling the weight of family, loyalty, and the fragile hope they all clung to. As the night deepened, a storm gathered beyond the city lights. Rain pounded against the hospital windows, thunder rolling like drums of fate. Inside, the herbalist rested for a few hours, gathering strength to prepare another batch of tea as dawn approached. In her dreams, she saw fields of plants swaying in a golden breeze and heard her grandmother's voice whispering encouragement. She knew that more tests awaited her, questions about safety, efficacy, and the politics that hung behind every whisper. Yet she felt a calm certainty, a quiet conviction that if she followed the path laid out by her ancestors, the truth would emerge. And so, as the storm raged outside and the world held its breath, the story of the blind herbalist and the ailing president hovered on the brink of change. Could a humble remedy redefine the nation's understanding of healing? Would those in power choose to honor her wisdom, or would they bury it under layers of bureaucracy and doubt? The next moments would reveal whether compassion could overcome skepticism, whether an old woman's quiet faith could withstand the roar of politics, and whether the president's life truly depended on more than medicine, on respect, humility, and the unseen power of the land itself. The air crackled with possibility, and the world waited for the next chapter of a story that began with mockery and might end with redemption. Rain drummed against the hospital windows as dawn broke, and in the dimly lit room, the president stirred. His breathing was steady now, the fever that had once consumed him reduced to a mere shadow. His daughter, relief softening her eyes, reached for his hand. The machines that had been symbols of his decline now blinked in quiet rhythm, as if applauding his recovery. But the real miracle was not in the sterile tubes or the cold metal. It was in the tiny clay cup resting on the bedside table, empty now save for a few specks of sediment. The herbalist's remedy had done its work. Word spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the hospital gates, cameras blinking and microphones thrust forward. Social media buzzed with hashtags: Cost Village Herbalist, Cost Miracle Remedy, Cost President Healed. Inside, the president managed a weak smile as he addressed the waiting crowd, his voice steady but measured. He thanked the doctors and nurses who worked around the clock. But his expression grew contemplative when he spoke of the herbalist. I owe my life to an unexpected healer, an elderly blind woman from a small coastal village. Her remedy, her faith in nature, brought me back from the brink. The words rippled through the audience like a relief wave, but just as quickly, they gave rise to murmurs of surprise and skepticism. Some saw it as a touching tribute to tradition. Others bristled at the suggestion that modern medicine had failed. Back in the village, the herbalist sat by the ocean at sunset, her fingers trailing in the warm water. She watched the horizon glow with shades of pink and gold, feeling the ebb of the tide beneath her. The villagers had gathered around her hut earlier, offering apologies for their mocking laughter and bringing small gifts of food and handmade crafts. Ahmed, the young fisherman who once joined in the taunts, came forward with a basket of freshly caught shrimp. He knelt, bowing his head. You saved the president, he said softly. But you saved me too, when my sister was sick. I'm sorry I did not believe. The herbalist smiled, her sightless eyes reflecting the fading light. For her, forgiveness was as natural as breathing. She placed a gentle hand on Ahmed's shoulder and gave him a nod that felt like a blessing, but not everyone was ready to celebrate. In the capital's grand corridors, the finance minister watched the president's televised speech with clenched fists. The emphasis on a traditional cure challenged every assumption he held about progress and development. He called an emergency meeting of the cabinet, insisting that they craft a narrative that framed the herbalist's contribution as an anecdote rather than a breakthrough. He feared pharmaceutical markets collapsing and rural healers gaining sudden influence. Ministers arguing for caution warned against upsetting urban voters accustomed to white coats and lab tests. Yet, as the president's recovery dominated, headlines, even skeptics found themselves moved by his genuine gratitude. The public's demand for recognition of the herbalist's role could not be ignored. At the same time, the senior physician who had once doubted the remedy stood in his private office, reading stack upon stack of medical journals sent from around the world. Researchers in distant countries were already requesting details of the ingredients: coastal mint, moonlit vine, mangrove blossom. Labs offered to analyze the active compounds. He realized that the line between skepticism and curiosity could be crossed with a single step: an honest, unbiased investigation. That afternoon, he wrote a memo to the president, urging him to support a formal study of the herbalist's remedy. He believed that if they embraced the healing potential of traditional medicine, they could pioneer a new era of integrated healthcare. It was a risky proposition, but one that could honor both science and heritage. Meanwhile, the president's daughter sat by her father's bedside, reflecting on the journey they had all taken. She remembered how frightened she had been when his life dangled in uncertainty. Now she felt a renewed sense of purpose. When he was well enough, she planned to travel to the village herself, to meet the woman who had taught them all a profound lesson in humility. She imagined telling her father that he had the chance not only to heal himself, but to heal a nation torn between modern and traditional values. Her thoughts were interrupted by his soft voice. "My child," he said, "this remedy reminds me that leadership is not just politics or strategy. It is empathy, listening to voices we have ignored, valuing every heartbeat, even those from the humblest places." She squeezed his hand, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. In the village, the herbalist received a letter delivered on thick white paper with the presidential seal. The president invited her to a ceremony in the capital, a recognition of her service. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her worn leather pouch. That night she sat with her neighbors around a crackling bonfire, sharing stories of her grandmother, who had taught her each plant's secret. Children gathered at her feet, eyes wide with wonder as they listened to tales of ancient healers. The air smelled of salt and smoke, and for the first time in years, celebration filled the village. They were no longer the forsaken coastal hamlet. They were part of a story that spanned the ribbons of coast and marble halls alike. As the day of the ceremony arrived, the herbalist dressed in a plain, hand-stitched dress that had guided her through decades of dawns and dusks. Ahmed supported her as they boarded the bus bound for the city. Villagers watched the bus disappear down the winding lane, smoke from morning fires drifting in its wake. They knew that her life was about to change, but they also trusted that she would remain grounded, her heart tied to the land that had always guided her. At the grand hall, reporters lined the red carpet, eager for a glimpse of the woman whose simple remedy had shaken the corridors of power. When she entered, blindfolded by fate but not by spirit, she paused, feeling the hush that fell over the crowd. The president approached her with genuine respect, offering a hand that bridged centuries of knowledge. He stood before the assembled audience, government officials, scientists, journalists, and everyday citizens, and spoke from the heart. "Today we recognize that wisdom often hides in humble places," he said. "This village herbalist reminded us that the most powerful tools of healing can be rooted in tradition, guided by compassion, and nurtured by faith." The applause that followed was not mere courtesy. It was an embrace of something larger than politics, a celebration of unity between the modern and the ancient. Even the finance minister, seated in the second row, found his eyes dampened, the lines of worry on his forehead softening. The senior physician, standing beside him, felt the weight of his earlier skepticism lift. They both understood that this moment marked a shift, a recognition that true progress did not require the erasure of old ways, but their integration into new paradigms. In the weeks that followed, studies began to document the herbalist's remedy. Universities partnered with village healers to create community clinics that combined modern medicine with traditional treatments. Pharmacies started carrying bottled extracts of mangrove blossom, labeled with cautionary instructions alongside certification seals. Rural health workers were trained to identify medicinal plants and collaborate with local elders. The news headlines cheered: "Healing beyond borders, tradition meets science, coastal wisdom revolutionizes healthcare." Keywords like traditional medicine, integrated healthcare, village healer, and medical breakthrough trended online, drawing attention to the possibility of a more holistic future. Back in her coastal home, the herbalist continued her morning walks along the shore. She still gathered the same plants, guided by the waves and the wind. But now, children walked beside her, curious to learn how to crush leaves and boil roots. Young villagers asked for her blessings before weddings, and elders sought her advice when illnesses struck. She taught them not just herbal recipes, but the importance of listening, to the land, to each other, and to their own hearts. The Ministry of Health invited her to advisory panels, though she always spoke with the same soft voice, reminding officials that greatness came from humility. The president, fully recovered, often visited the village to check on her and the community clinics sprouting like dawn lilies. On one visit, he knelt beside her in a simple wooden hut, watching her hands move over fresh mint leaves as she brewed a steaming tea. He placed his hand over hers and said, "Thank you for teaching me that leadership is service." She smiled, feeling the warmth of his words more profound than any applause in a marble hall. As the seasons changed and the tides rose and fell, the story of the village herbalist became more than a one-time headline. It became a living legacy. Villages across the nation began to celebrate their local healers and record folk knowledge that had once been dismissed. Medical schools opened departments for ethnobotany, and government grants funded research into plant-based remedies. The simple clay cup that saved a president became a symbol of collaboration, reminding everyone that true healing encompassed mind, body, and spirit. In the end, the most important takeaway was not merely that a blind woman's remedy could save a powerful man. It was that respect, humility, and openness to different perspectives could heal divisions far deeper than illness. When the world seemed split between modern and traditional power and poverty, it was a quiet healer from a coastal village who reminded everyone that wisdom knows no boundaries. And as long as people continued to listen to the whispers of the wind, the echo of ancient lullabies, and the guidance of humble hands, there would always be hope for a future where every story, no matter how small, had the power to change the world.